Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, and today's video is going to be my January wrap-up. January was not a good reading month for me. I only read 5 books, so this video is going to be pretty short and sweet, but that's alright, because remember, it doesn't matter how many books you read, it really only matters that you're reading, because we don't want to be illiterate people. That's a choice, and we don't want to make that choice. Anyways, my first book that I read this month was A House at the Bottom of a Lake by Josh Malerman. This was actually my first Josh Malerman book that I read. So I'm very excited to finally have read something by him. He's a pretty big name in the horror industry, especially after writing Bird Box and Mallory. And I struggled with this book. So I gave this a 3.5 stars. And I read this from January 5th to January 6th. And honestly, most of my issues with the book were because of the writing style. The sentences were very short and choppy, and it felt like the author was trying to write from a teenage perspective, but it was unsuccessful, and it kind of took me out of the story a little bit. I found myself unable to fully immerse in the world and in the book, and I just couldn't get past the writing style, and the choppy sentences were like too repetitive too often. So that really took me out of the book because I couldn't help but notice it. And also, this did not feel like a horror to me. Sure, there are horror elements, but the overall like vibe, aesthetic, feeling of it wasn't horror. It was more like a mystery or a thriller. So I think this is marketed in the wrong genre. I think this should be marketed as a thriller because while there are horror elements, it just doesn't have the horror feel to it. I mean, I do love this cover though. This is one of my favorite book covers that I own. It's so freaking cool. And I really did like the concept. I love the concept of like abandoned buildings or haunted houses and putting a haunted house underwater. So cool. I loved that part. I was such a fan of that, and I was very disappointed when it wasn't actually a scary book. And this book does remind me a lot of a horror movie that you can go watch. It's called The Deep House, I believe, but it's like almost the exact same concept, just actually scary, which is what I was wanting from this book. But yeah, so there's a movie recommendation if you've read this and you want to watch something like this. It's called The Deep House. And I watched it on a website. I'm not sure where else you could find it, but yeah. So this was a 3.5 star, and I just wish I had enjoyed it more because I'm a little disappointed. I really wanted to love this. I'm sad that I didn't. Okay, so my next book is Dark Across the Bay by Anaya Allborn, and this I rated a 4.5 stars, and I read it from January 9th to January 12th. So I read this in a pretty short period. And oh my gosh, this book was amazing. The pacing was amazing. The flashback chapters were amazing. They added so much depth and layer to the story, and we were getting like 2 stories in one. I love that. I love flashback chapters and like horror thrillers, and this, because they serve, if the author uses them correctly, they serve a purpose and they add to the book, and these added so much to the book. And I also like that there was a deeper message of grief within the book. Historically, horror has been used to discuss bigger messages such as racism, grief, things like that. And so I'm really happy to see some storyline that involves grief so much in this. It was very fascinating to read about how all of the characters showed different aspects of their grief, literally and figuratively. I thought that was very interesting. And I also love this cover. This cover is just so cool. This is also my first Anaya Allborn, which is kind of sad considering she's been writing books for quite a while. Her other ones you might have heard of are The Shuddering or Brother. I'm hoping to get to The Shuddering this year because that sounds so interesting to me. especially because I live in kind of a cold, mountainy state. So I really love this book. The plot twists were amazing. And even if I saw them coming when they were revealed, I was like, I don't care. They were so good. I really did enjoy this book. I had such a fun time with it. The only reason it's not a 5-star is because there was some repetition in the beginning that I was unsure if the author had intended to be there or not. But it kind of took me out of the story and threw me for a loop. And I was like, why am I reading the same thing twice? Kind of a deal. So that's the only reason this isn't 5 stars. But man, I really recommend this book. It was such a ride, and it's literally so good. I highly recommend this. And the next book I read is Audition by Ryu Murakami. So I do love reading Japanese horror and thrillers, just because they're so different from American horror and thrillers. And I don't mind reading translations. I don't normally have a problem with it. This book, the translation was so good that I never felt like it was a translation. It flowed seamlessly. There wasn't any weird issues, because sometimes translations aren't always accurate and sometimes you can tell that. I could not tell that with this at all. So this one I gave 2.5 stars, which is kind of sad. I'm very sad about that. I wanted to love this book so much, and I didn't. I think if I watched the movie, I would end up liking the movie more than the book, which is saying something. And I read this from the 14th of January to the 18th of January. So I read this pretty quickly, and it felt like it took me forever. This book was so slow, and I had such a hard time getting into it, which kind of disappoints me, because this is such a beloved book and movie, and it's super popular, and I didn't like it. I couldn't get into it. The casual misogyny in this book was so bad. So bad that it turned me off of the book hardcore. And once I was done, I was like, I don't know if I'd ever read that again. Kind of a deal. It bothered me so much. And it was a lot of misogyny towards Japanese women, which I did not like, because if these Japanese men are going to be misogynistic towards Japanese women, but say really amazing things about other races of women, that's such an ick. I don't like that. And there is a huge trigger for animal mutilation. I didn't know that before I read the book, and then I read that part and I was like, I don't like animal mutilation. I don't vibe with it. I try not to read it. I don't know how I didn't know that it was in here before I read this. So this is my trigger warning for anyone who wants to read this book. There is animal mutilation in here. If you can handle that, okay. But if you can't, don't read this book. And it was just kind of an average thriller. I was super disappointed with it. It just felt like mid-level thriller. It wasn't anything super exciting. It was boring. The pacing was kind of slow, and for a short book to be slow, I don't think that's something you necessarily want. So yeah, I had a lot of issues with this book. I really did, and I'm kind of sad that I did, because it is such a well-known story, and I just couldn't vibe with it. Sucks. Okay, the fourth book I read this month was Cast from Heaven by Lee Kelsey. I'm gonna pop a picture right here. I read this as an ebook, which is why it is a picture. I had some issues with this book. I gave it a 3.5 stars, just because it was what I needed in the moment that I was reading it. I wanted junk food fantasy romance, the fantasy romance that's instantly gratifying, and the romance is the whole entire concept of the book. I love that. But the ending felt really rushed, and it felt like the author made everything happen just to set up the second book at the end. And I didn't like that, because then it's if you don't read the second book, well then the ending sucks, kind of a thing. And I hated that. I don't like how the author set up the second book either. I'm not a fan of that. So I probably won't continue reading this series. It is a trilogy. I'm probably not going to continue. And there are some trigger warnings for sexual abuse and abuse. So please just be aware of that. And yeah, it was just kind of average, nothing really exciting. The writing was good and the editing was good. So those parts were good. And those parts, and you know, the whole concept and the storyline was actually pretty good too. It was just the ending that kind of ruined the book for me. But yes, that is the 4th book I read this month. And we're moving on to the last book I read. Okay, so the last book I read this month is 12 Nights at Rotterhouse by J.W. Auker. So I ended up really enjoying this book. I gave it 4 stars. And I read this from January 9th to January 27th. It took me so long to read this book. It took me almost like the whole month. I don't know why. It wasn't that I wasn't interested in it. It was just that when I sat down to read it, I was never in a reading mood. So that's why it took me so long. And, you know, in here, again, we have some casual misogyny, although there was only like one instance of it, and it was nowhere near as bad as Audition. So I'm more okay with that. I just want any women who pick up this book to be aware, because, you know, we deal with it enough in real life. So the reason I gave this 4 stars is because the ending kind of came out of nowhere. And I finished the book and I was just sitting there thinking, and I was like, did I see that ending coming? I don't think so. So I'm really unsure if the author laid the groundwork throughout the book for that ending to happen, because I saw part of the ending coming. I figured that out. But then the other part, I was like, there was no like setup for this, and like the setup that was there didn't make any sense. So that was my issue with this book, was really the ending. It didn't make any sense, and it wasn't planned, and it wasn't thought out, and that's at least what it felt like to me. I feel like that happened because the author relied too much on an unreliable narrator. Now, when it comes to horror and thrillers, I love unreliable narrators. They're so good for plot twists. But when an author relies too heavily on them, it can feel like endings and plot twists come out of nowhere, because they're relying on, oh, well, you don't even know the full story because you've only seen it from this character's perspective. But they still have to figure out a way to give the reader clues and hints as to what the ending or plot twist could possibly be. And that way, when the reader finishes, it's like, oh, I could have seen that coming if I'd picked up on all that stuff. So that was my main issue with the book, is that I just felt like the ending kind of surprised me, and not in a good way. Not in a good way at all. But otherwise, this was a very enjoyable read, and it also does discuss some racism as well, so please be aware of that. And yeah, I also really love this cover. I really love this cover. It's super cool, super unique, very good haunted house trope. I love that part. The haunted house was so good, and it was like actually haunted for most of the book. So these are the 5 books that I read in January. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these and what you thought about them, and I will see you guys on my next video. Bye!